Hey everybody, what's going on? So I wanted to do a little special thing today because you guys know I've been talking about Ukraine over and over, and you've probably heard all of my talking points, but I wanted to bring somebody cool in, Michael Weiss, who you guys know if you've listened to the Bulwark, really if you listen to anything that has to do with foreign policy or like actual normal people, you know who Michael Weiss is, and he's got a great history. You and I have been friends, Mike. What for? Was it start with the Syria stuff, didn't it? Is that kind of when we got
We
rolling?
started following each other because we were both on that case big time.
Yeah.
Uh,
Yeah.
then I guess it morphed into the Ukraine stuff, but the long arm of the Kremlin is sort of touched everything that we seem to be interested in to care about.
Yeah, it's
This
crazy. It's crazy. So what I wanted to do is bring Michael on just to like let's talk about where we're at on the war and honestly how serious this stuff is. You and I were talking offline just about the country and where we're at. So let me just ask you to start. Where is the war between Ukraine and Russia? Everybody is saying, Russia's going to win this thing. Let's just stop the war so that we save Ukrainian lives. Give me your kind of thought on where does the war sit generally right
Well, I mean, whether by accident or design, right now, and if you discount the recent events in Kursk, which we'll come back to, but right now, and the battlescape in Ukraine, sovereign Ukraine, has actually stabilized and improved dramatically from where we were 4, 5, 6 months ago, right? Russian advances have slowed to a halt, if not have been reversed in several directions, Chasiv Yar, Toretsk. So we are choosing this moment when the Ukrainians are sort of getting another kind of shot in the arm, as it were, to rob them of everything: weapon supplies, intelligence sharing, which is crucial. I mean, we make this distinction, or some of us make this distinction. I would call it a distinction without a difference between defensive and offensive intelligence capability. So, in other words, we'll give the Ukrainians early warning that Russian missiles and drones are headed their way, but we won't give them intelligence to target the airfields from which these aircraft are taking off, right? I mean, if you destroy the aircraft before they can bomb you, I would call that pretty defensive. So we're sort of in this mode of hair splitting as to what kind of support is still coming or not coming. But the Ukrainians are actually, there's momentum on their side, or there was up until recently. So the big setback for them is this Russian breakthrough in Kursk, which is the enclave in sovereign Russia that Ukraine invaded in August. Everyone thought it was just one of these cross-border raids. No, it turned out to be a pretty full-scale occupation, and you've got 10,000 plus Ukrainian troops fighting not just the Russians, but now the North Koreans who are being used as cannon fodder, right? So we have cut off the Ukrainian ability to fire ATACMS and GIMLRs across the border, which has made a crucial difference for their efforts to maintain hold of Kursk. For them, this is a bargaining chip for any future negotiation or peace settlement. We'll give you back your territory in exchange for territory of ours that you are currently occupying. And all of this is I would argue, being rendered forfeit. And it's not, I just want to be very clear because, you and I, we do TV, we do media hits, and we're asked about, well, do you think that the minerals deal can be salvaged? This is not about Zelensky putting on a suit and tie and, checking all the boxes of whatever Donald Trump or Donnie from Queens considers to be high protocol for matters of statecraft. This is about fundamentally a strategic realignment of the United States to be with Russia, and not just against Ukraine, I would argue, but against the pro-Ukrainian or liberal democratic elements of the European Union and NATO, with which Donald Trump seems to be picking fights left and right. Just today, I mean, hours ago, minutes ago, both Elon Musk and Marco Rubio decided to start trolling and body slamming Radek Sikorski, the Polish foreign minister. Now remember, Adam, in term one, the one European country other than Viktor Orban's Hungary that Donald Trump had fairly good relationships with, actually very strong relationships with, was Poland. And now all of a sudden we're telling the Poles they should say thank you. They're ingrates and upstarts because they pay for Starlink. When has anybody, a purchaser of a commercial satellite system, ever had to say thank you for giving their money to
Yeah.
a big technological conglomerate? I mean, it's utterly bizarre unless you view it in this sort of kind of full spectrum analysis, which I think is very clear. And the Europeans and the Ukrainians, I think, are beginning to see the writing on the wall here, that the party is over.
Well, let me just, by the way, say thank you to Sony for the TV behind me that I paid for, but I want to thank them so they don't cut it off. I want to thank whoever made this camera, Nikon, whatever. I want to thank every piece of equipment I am using in here today because I want it to continue to work. So thank you to the manufacturers, even though I paid you. Let me ask you a question. I'm kind of jumping ahead on where I wanted to talk about on this, but so we talk about, okay, is Russia or Ukraine winning? Obviously, I agree with you. Ukraine's got the momentum. And honestly, the crazy thing to me is I think a fundamental misunderstanding that people have of warfare. Like for a defending country, the defending country doesn't win by invading and taking out the opposing country's capital. They win by continuing to defend and eventually wear out the offensive combat power of the attacker until the attacker basically cries uncle. That's how you defend a country.
Right.
And that's exactly what's happening. But it's interesting to me because if we pretend like for a moment, if we pretend like Donald Trump doesn't have a preference in this war, and I, like you, think he does, if we just pretend like he doesn't, the fact that he is pulling stuff away from Ukraine means that he is basically doing his level best to put both sides on a level playing field, which would mean, by definition, if he has to take things away from Ukraine to do that, and he has to threaten our allies to do that, then that would mean that obviously Ukraine's in the catbird seat, right? Isn't that how you see it?
Yeah, I wouldn't even say level playing field. I would say he's looking to give Russia the advantage.
Mm-hmm.
I mean, if you're let's take him at face value. He thinks the war is devastating, it's horrific for both sides. This is true. He wants to end it as soon as possible. Okay. But the aggressor, the adversary, America's enemy in this, at least as far as 3 years of robust diplomacy, sanctions, and security assistance is concerned, is Russia. And yet we are doing everything to give Russia freebies, extracting concessions, shaking down our ally and partner, Ukraine, telling them, well, we want $500 billion of your natural resources. Oh, okay, we'll water that down slightly. But now we don't have a deal there. We're going to relitigate and renegotiate that deal. And even that, according to NBC News, is not sufficient for us to turn the spigot back on in terms of weapon supplies and intelligence sharing. And even beyond that, again, the messaging here is quite clear. Suddenly, Article 5 is pay to play, right? Mm-hmm. Collective defense of NATO, one of the founding principles of the transatlantic order, is now being abrogated. I mean, if you don't meet and remember, the goalposts here move too. If you don't meet your 3% spending of GDP on defense, now it's 5%. We
don't even do 5%.
We don't even do 5%. And they want to slash and burn that too. So, again, if I try to put myself in the shoes of, like, let's say I'm an intelligence analyst sitting in an embassy somewhere in the world, and I'm watching the host government of this country get up to these sorts of antics and to sort of do this sort of messaging and signposting. I have drawn a very clear conclusion about where things are headed. I think in the West, we have such a hard time fathoming that 80 plus years of Pax Americana, post-war security order, which, by the way, isn't designed for our benefit first and foremost. It's designed to keep Europe from going to war with itself, right? And then, as a second order priority, having the United States dragged into such a conflict again, which in this go-round with nuclear weapons, I shouldn't have to tell anybody what that would entail. But all of this is now being rent asunder. And I think a lot of us lack the imagination or the, as Orwell said, sometimes, staring reality in the face or seeing what is in front of one's nose is one of the hardest things you can do. What is in front of our nose is exactly this. Donald Trump would rather be allied with Russia. And perhaps there's an element of his cabal of advisors who think that we can pull Russia strategically away from China. Good luck, babe. Nice work if you can get it. I heard the same claptrap about doing that with the Iranians by Mike Flynn in term 1, and look how that turned out. Iranian drones are being used and ballistic missiles are being used in Ukraine. But fundamentally, he just doesn't care about the things that have governed both parties in this country as a matter of statecraft, foreign policy, and just geopolitical concern. Our national security is being rewritten such that there is no security anymore. Mm-hmm. Counterintelligence capability. People I talk to at the FBI, law enforcement, we are about to let the Russians in through the front door. What do you think is going to happen when we reopen these embassies and consulates and just bring in all these, quote, Russian diplomats? I mean, how many SVR and GRU officers are going to be welcomed in? And is anybody going to have the cojones to go to the president or DOJ and say, this is what they're doing? They're spying on us. They're recruiting American government officials or people with clearance. Nobody wants to bring up the R word, which is Russia, with this president, especially now.
Yeah, and that's the weird thing is, like, even if somebody had the courage to sit with him, and this is the difference between the second Trump administration and the first, they churned through a lot of people, but at least at the beginning of the Trump administration, you had people that were willing to actually give him advice or to tell him no or to stand up. Literally, the message that's happened, I mean, this is exactly the story of the emperor has no clothes, right? Where nobody will tell him no. And the other thing, though, is, and I truly wonder, and it's sad that I have to think this, is like, okay, even if somebody sat down and said, hey, here is proof that the Russians have infiltrated X, Y, and Z, this government department or whatever, would he care? Would he not care because he's got some sympathy to Russia? Would he not care because of, the whole Russia hoax thing? I don't know. But I know that our national security is at risk. And the weird thing about this is I'm trying to think like, okay, if I was president of the United States and I was a hardcore narcissist, which he obviously is, he either has to attack you or he has to be praised. That's like the definition of narcissism because they get the same dopamine hit either way. But I was thinking like, if I was the president and a narcissist, wouldn't I want to be like the big guy on campus in NATO? Wouldn't I want to stand up against the Russians? And if I could take the Russian economy down so that history would write all about how I did that? So the thing that's always gotten me is he's willingly making himself look weaker and the country look weaker. And that's why I wonder what's really going on here. And again, we don't have proof that there's any affection to Russia necessarily beyond what we see. But that's always been really weird to me is just this, like, if you're president, I would want this country to be as big and powerful as possible. That makes me look good, right? Don't you think that way?
It's funny, too. I remember seeing a Russian, quote unquote, diplomat who was really an SVR officer, and not just any SVR officer, one of Robert Hansen's case officers in Washington, D.C. But he's a very voluble commentator on American politics and very insightful. And, he had posted at one point that the Kremlin quite respects John Bolton, fire-breathing, walrus mustachioed John Bolton who wants to go to war with everybody because he was tough.
Yeah.
Because he didn't take their bullshit lying down. And they respect that. When you are weak, when you are soft, when you are offering yourself up to them, giving up services in exchange for nothing, or even worse, in exchange for financial reward, they see you as cheap. They see you as a mercenary. You have no principle. You're not a real man. The GRU literally used to have a term for people who weren't full recruits, but just were doing their bidding for them in exchange for Dane Geld or, ideological sympathy. They called them shit eaters, right? Mm-hmm. Donald Trump is the classic shit eater to the Russians. They cannot believe their luck right now. Without any kind of back and forth, without any kind of attempt to litigate the terms of a peace settlement, all he is doing is humiliating and punishing America's partner and ally, which is also the bargaining chip here for any kind of long-term grand design with the Russians, right? He's just putting a leash on Ukraine and, as General Kellogg put it, taking a 2x4 to this battered and bruised mule as a way of showing it who's boss, putting it into submission. In exchange for what? What have the Russians offered us? Nothing. Nord Stream 2 contracts, we don't need that. And who cares? That, as Donald Trump would tell you, one of the achievements of his first term in office was sanctioning the hell out of Nord Stream 2, rendering it ineffective, right? So it's very bizarre. And again, the only analysis I can give to this is that, Trump is desperate to be well liked by Putin. I think there's the former BBC journalist, Malcolm Muggeridge, who was a fellow traveler of Soviet communism in the 90s until he actually went to Moscow and saw what Soviet communism was. His friends, Sidney and Beatrice Webb, who remained fellow travelers of Soviet communism well past the point of diminishing returns. There's actually a fellowship or a chair at the London School of Economics named for them. He was once asked, Muggeridge, why are the Webbs so besotted with Stalin? To which Muggeridge replied, because Stalin is doing to intellectuals in Moscow what they'd like to be doing to intellectuals in London. That real Jones for the strong man, a guy who doesn't have to worry about red tape. He has enemies within and without. He just kills them and gets away with it. Constant adulation, military parades down the main thoroughfare of the capital, children kind of being dandled on his knee. Everybody loves him, right? Makes a show of loving him because they're terrified of the consequences of not loving him. You call it narcissism. I mean, it is world historic narcissism and megalomania with Donald Trump. And I think he absolutely identifies with Putin in that respect.
It's crazy because it's like he's trying to impress Putin right now. It's like it's not a negotiation. He's trying to be like, see, I'm really on your side here. I'm gonna actually cost Ukrainian lives. And I just want to be clear. His tweet the other day about like, well, Russia's pounding Ukraine, we're gonna sanction them and put tariffs on. Complete BS. It makes him look tough to his crowd. But in reality, how much? I mean, we buy nesting dolls from Russia. That's about it. So that's about what you can sanction, and or there's not much left to sanction. That's about all you can tariff.
What is a tariff going to do, or what are
Right.
the tariffs going to do in Russia? And also, by the way, he didn't say he's going to do this. He said he is strongly considering.
Yeah.
He's strongly considering doing something, sort of for show that wouldn't have any severe economic consequences or impact on Russia, whereas he is currently doing much that is having severe military impact on Ukraine. Right.
Yep.
So again, the imbalance is staring us right in the face.
The crazy thing to me. So just I'm going to get off subject for a second because you were talking about people's affection for him, and I've tried to explain this because I can kind of feel it in my soul, but I don't know how to put words to it. Which is when the question is asked, why does the right have a fondness for Putin? And it's like, look, the right is under the impression that they are embattled, that they have been, they're basically hunkering in their bunker. I mean, you remember the old conspiracies about the FEMA's got the guillotine trains for Christians, that they're, in these FEMA farms. And so you're raised in that environment for 20 years. And then all of a sudden, somebody comes up, and this is the attraction to Donald Trump too, but somebody like Putin comes up, ties himself to the Russian Orthodox Church, which is all bullshit, but that looks great. Right now he looks like he's doing this for God. They cloak things in religious stuff. He says, gays and transgenders aren't welcome in Russia. And, you've been sitting here for 20 years feeling like American society is going too far. And all of a sudden he becomes your fighter. And I think, even if Trump doesn't have any compromise with Russia, there's a reality that he knows his base loves this strength and the strongman, and he does too. There's something weird about it that it's hard for me to describe to people, but I can feel why the right has an affection to him. And part of the problem, Michael, is like we need leaders that can pull us back from that reset our expectations every day about what right and wrong is. We haven't had that.
No, I agree. And there's two interesting things here. One, we continue to treat Russia like it's the Soviet Empire.
Right.
We have nuclear weapons, right? And we think that they have all the dispensations that derive therefrom, right? A lot of people who support Trump and would support, peace on any terms, which is to say selling Ukraine to the Russians, probably are unaware of what countries that used to belong to the Warsaw Pact or the Soviet Union as annexed colonies are now in NATO and are, more diehard pro-American than any other countries in the world. But we treat it as this colossus, and yet it has a GDP smaller than that of the state of California, right? Collective Europe, or the EU, already has 10 times the buying power of Russia. And if you add the UK and Norway, which are not in the EU, it's even more, right? And yet we are cowed, we are terrified of this juggernaut. And, one of the things I tell the Ukrainians is you didn't just defeat the Russian military, but you defeated decades, both Cold War and post-Cold War and post-Soviet propaganda that was sort of assimilated or imbibed into the American framework and understanding of Russia, because you chop them down to size, even though you were meant to be overrun in 2 weeks, your capital fallen in 72 hours. That's one thing. The other thing, though, and people kind of look at me like I have three heads when I say this, fighting Soviet communism or Marxism-Leninism at the intellectual, moral, and informational level was a lot easier than fighting Putinism, because Susan Sontag once said that the average reader of Reader's Digest has a better understanding of what's going on in the USSR than the average reader of The Nation, by which she meant left-wing intellectuals could kind of lather themselves up thinking that Moscow was the third Rome and the future of all civilization lie in socialism. But to the average American, the man in the street, the good God-fearing Christian American of mythology and stereotype, these were godless commies, and they had to be beaten, right? Now, if you ask a Russian, what is Putinism? You're going to get 10,000 different answers depending on the time of day, the day of the week, and which Russian you're asking, right? You talk about this kind of projection of Christian civilization and family values, traditionalism, and all these things. Yeah, this is the hologram of what Russia has been cultivating. And, it arguably began right after George W. Bush's inauguration, when he met with Putin, and Putin made a real concerted effort to wear his crucifix around his neck, because he knew that an evangelical Christian would appreciate that. It's continued ever since. I lived in the UK in 2000, and I saw that Russian intelligence officers from the embassy were making a desperate bid to cultivate members of the Conservative Party. There was actually a front group created called Conservative Friends of Russia, which managed to recruit, or at least kind of add various ornaments from the kind of Thatcherite Cold War era, such as Sir Malcolm Rifkin. And I was wondering, why on earth would conservatives want to ally with Russia? And the answer was, well, because they talk about God, country, traditional values. Now, this is no longer Soviet communism. They have a market economy. We have billionaires. We have sushi. We want to be part of the collective West and blah, 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 blah. No, they don't. You know, they define themselves both internally and externally in their enmity toward the West, right? I mean, the GRU was created to prepare for imminent war with the West, and its mission, its raison d'etre, has not changed in 100+ years of history. Putin can try and cultivate and psychologically manipulate people in the West to advance Russian interests, but fundamentally, he does not respect or trust or want to be part of this sort of community, if you like. And people, they don't realize it. They think that, no, he's being sincere. He's telling the truth.
Well, that's the crazy thing is, like, when people think back to traditional America, right? You think back to not Opie and Anthony, but the Mayberry Show, that kind of stuff. And, the reality is how many kids were being molested that couldn't go and tell somebody, right? We hear about all those stories now. How many times were wives abused by husbands that, either drank themselves to death or whatever. And it's like, yeah, on TV, that was a beautiful time to live. In reality, people didn't feel free to talk. It was, if you were African American in this country, you had less rights. It was a terrible time. And, but they've just done a good job of this mythology. And so what I want to do, because I don't want this to go on forever, because I know people have stuff to do today, but I want to ask you quickly can you just talk about where Biden had some shortcomings in this war? Because I think it's important to discuss that, what he could have done differently to maybe have the war over by now. Because look, obviously I would take Biden's policy 100 times over Trump's policy, but I think he deserves a little criticism for this. Do you want to kind of run with that a little bit?
Yeah, I do. I think, Biden is sort of a tragic case because on the one hand, the declassification of intelligence designed to put the world on notice that this invasion was inevitable, it was coming, and also to rally skeptical allies, particularly the French and those who did not agree with it was actually an Anglo-American intelligence collection mechanism that was declassified. So hats off to our friends, the British, until they're no longer our friends, which is happening in record time. I give him full marks for that. But again, we come back to this assimilated and incorporated view of Russia as this 10-foot tall colossus. The prevailing, not even conventional wisdom, but the prevailing consensus was Ukraine has no chance. It's going to be gone. Best we can do is government in exile, Poland, the UK, whatever for Zelensky. We'll give them javelins, we'll give them sort of light weaponry, but really prepare them for an insurgency. So a kind of recursion to partisan warfare, which, defined the anti-Soviet period in the Baltics up until in some cases, the 60s and 70s. We wrote Ukraine off because we did not have the imagination to realize that actually much of what Russia has been proclaiming itself to be was based on Potemkin paper. Ukrainians have no love for any member of the Russian opposition, perhaps except Garry Kasparov. And Garry is practically an American now. But I remember arguing with them about Navalny because, Navalny had these sort of nationalist background. He said some very chauvinistic and unpleasant things about Ukrainians, Georgians. And I said, look, but one thing you have to appreciate that Navalny has done is he has completely unmasked the Russian state as a giant kleptocracy. I mean, crooks and thieves was his term for United Russia, Putin's party. But I mean, they're all whores. They all just steal from the till. So any notion of patriotism and, mother, it's all nonsense. They line their pockets. How is it you can imagine that the one institution or the one complex in Russia that has somehow been immune, insusceptible to this pathological rot of corruption is the military? And I mean, you heard stories after the full-scale invasion got underway. We made 1,000 tanks. Well, no, you didn't. You made 600 tanks, and the 400 differential went to the pockets of Shoigu and his cronies, right? That was certainly, a big factor.
I remember seeing this, like the reactive armor on the tanks, and it was just like blocks of wood. They just fill bags of wood and call it reactive armor.
Absolutely. And that's not to say the Russians haven't adapted and corrected for these problems. I mean, look at all the generals and commanders that have been sacked or offed by the Ukrainians and replaced of necessity. Again, we had got it into our heads that Russia could not be defeated in a conventional capacity, much less by a country that has far fewer soldiers and a smaller population. But, I was in Ukraine in January of 2022. As a journalist, one sort of assignment I gave myself was, why are the Ukrainians not panicked? Everybody else is panicked on their behalf, but they're quite equable about it. And the answer I got proved to be wrong for the right reasons. Nobody thought, much of Ukraine, the population had seen active combat over the last decade, beginning in 2014, Russia's first invasion, their takeover of Crimea, dirty war in Donbass. They'd all been sent to the front. They all fought the Russians and understood their adversary. And everybody I talked to said, we don't think Putin is that insane. If he comes and tries to invade us and take us over, we will make him choke on our country. Well, lo and behold, he has choked on the country, right? And I think, okay, it was an analytic failure of the Biden administration not to anticipate some of this, or at least make some immediate contingency plans. The US in the space of 3 years has made Ukraine a NATO interoperable army, right? But imagine if we had put our chips on the Ukrainians at the beginning, and instead of just javelins and NLAWs, we were giving them, armored vehicles. We were giving them Patriot missile systems. We were giving them ATACMS and HIMARS and all the rest of it. How many Ukrainians would be alive today? And how much less territory would the Russians now occupy? It's about 20%. It might have been much, much less than that. So yes, we screwed that up. And also, and this is our own failure of political imagination here, Biden left and gave the keys to the White House, not of his own volition, but just because of the transition of power, to a guy who's now working, objectively speaking, on behalf of Moscow against Ukraine. So if we had won this war, or if we had resolved the war, I should say, and gotten to a negotiating point that put the Russians really on the back foot before Biden's first term was up. Okay. I try to avoid counterfactual history. It's a parlor game. It's not a serious enterprise. But these are questions that I'm being asked by Ukrainians. I can't avoid asking them of myself,
And I think it's important to ask, too, because, we could face this very situation in a different country or whatever at some point. And it's like, we can look back and say, remember when we slow walked support to Ukraine? Right. And what the cost was to that. So maybe we should do it differently this time. So as we kind of wrap up, I want to, because I don't want everybody to be hopeless, even though it feels very hopeless right now. Obviously, it looks like, and I hope I'm proven wrong, it looks like we're not going to be an ally to Ukraine anymore. We being the government, the American people will be. So that leaves Europe. What's your thoughts on what can Europe do best case scenario? What do you think they do? What's your fears? But if Europe steps up, can Ukraine win this war? Can they keep fighting?
I think so. There are a bunch of different variables here that need to be considered. Number one, there is no such thing as Europe as this monolith, right? You have different countries, competitive interests. You have outliers like Hungary and Slovakia now, which are more pro-Russian than pro-Ukraine. One thing that's been gratifying to see, though, is not just rhetoric, but decisions at the policy level being undertaken now, not only to make up for the shortfall that is already happened with respect to U.S. security assistance, but also for Europe to get its own security house in order. They realize that they can no longer rely on the United States. I just read an article in the Financial Times about this panic about, relying on A5s and American-made armaments. What if there's a kill switch, or what if the United States elects another lunatic who decides to cancel the ability of European countries to defend themselves with American-made weaponry? So Europe is now in a process of decoupling from the United States, which for the next 4 years is absolutely a necessity. And going forward is probably going to be, this vindicates Emmanuel Macron's strategic autonomy argument.
And by the way, it will cost U.S. jobs.
It will cost U.S. jobs, right? Because another aspect of security, I love arguing with people who tell me we're spending money in Ukraine and not right here at home. I'm like, do you understand that 70+% of American aid for Ukraine is invested right here in the United States? Factories belonging to a now vitiated American and military industrial complex, hiring American workers, building new armaments for our own military capability, while we give Ukraine outdated, in some cases expired weapons, which still work a damn sight better than the Russians. That's one thing. Second thing, which is important, and I think a lot of people are not kind of reckoned with yet. The war has changed dramatically since 2022, and things that mattered on the battlefield in 2022, 2023, they still matter, but not to the degree that they used to. Right? Artillery is not as critical as it once was, which is a good thing for Ukraine, because the estimates I'm seeing is the casualties and fatalities they're inflicting on the Russian side, upwards of 70% are delivered by drones.
Wow.
Which is great because Ukraine is manufacturing drones at scale. They have created multiple fleets actually, of first-person view, fiber optic cable guided drones. I mean, so the war has shifted. I mean, the Russians,
I hear they're going to do 4 million this year, or they have the capacity to make 4 million.
And the great thing about drones is they're cheap to make, and most of the parts are commercially sourced. So what Europe can do, and I think is realizing it must, is to invest in Ukraine's own military manufacturing capability and put money there. And also, and I didn't realize this actually myself until James Rushton, my writing partner, and I started to delve into, well, how does the war change and what can Europe do if the US abandons Ukraine? Depending on who you ask, I'll take the Wall Street Journal statistic on this. The Wall Street Journal says 55% of what Ukraine needs for its own defense is domestically sourced now.
Wow.
And the remainder is split between the US and Europe. So that kind of takes a lot of burden off the United States, which now is a good thing, right? We quoted a Ukrainian security official who actually said it was about 40% domestic and the rest split. But either way, the US pulling out of Ukraine hurts Ukraine, no question. Is it a death blow? Is it catastrophic? Does it mean, Russian, at this point, T-34 tanks, because they run out of all the Arctic.
World War II stuff.
Down Krishchatik, and no, it doesn't. They're going to still be able to defend themselves and still be able to fight. The question is, if there is a negotiated settlement, which Ukrainians are for, they want a security guarantee that Russia can't do this again.
And they earned it. They earned it.
They want that backed up by fire and steel because it's the Russians, right? When do they abide by any agreement unless there's a gun to their head? Why are we negotiating against ourselves? We're putting the Ukrainians at a disadvantage with every passing hour here.
Yeah, it's crazy. What's the best way people can follow your writing? Because for those that don't know, I kind of said it at the beginning, but we've been friends for a long time, but you've actually been a great kind of mentor to me on this stuff in terms of I always thought I knew a lot about Ukraine and Russia and stuff, but, being friends with you and following your stuff has gotten me to where I think I could compete with the biggest, Russian experts. So where can people read your stuff and follow you?
Well, first of all, that's very kind of you to say, and the feeling is mutual here. As one of the few Republicans who stood up to this nonsense early days, I mean, all credit and hats off to you, because we need more of your ilk, Adam. And unfortunately, I'm not seeing much opposition in this country. The opposition is coming from Europe and from Kyiv. But my writing, I'm an editor at The Insider, which is actually an independent Russian investigative news outlet. My colleagues are Christo Grozev, Roman Dobrokhotov. Together, we basically unmask Russian spies and intelligence operations, including ones that are kinetic. GRU poisoners, attempts to blow up weapons factories or shopping malls in Europe. That's kind of our beat at the moment. And then I write essays for New Lines magazine, which I was a founding editor of. So when I have a kind of long form piece on Ukraine, I tend to publish it there. But the easiest way is, I've been trying to abandon Twitter for the last years.
We're trying.
I'm in it till the bitter end here. But if you follow me, it's Michael D. Weiss on Twitter.
Awesome. Well, Michael, thanks, man. It was great chatting with you, and I know my audience is going to love this, and appreciate you spending the time on a Sunday.
Well, just tell everybody who hates you and me to direct all the hatred to you and not to me.
That'll happen anyway. Don't worry about that. Thanks, buddy.
You got it. Take care.